I've got a new family, so we're getting a divorce. Take your daughter and leave. Oh, and I think you know, but don't expect a single penny for compensation. As Steve declared this, Mandy was nodding along beside him. The two of them seemed to suggest with their attitude that I was the one who was wrong. Only the babies, asleep in their strollers, were oblivious to it all. Steve had never helped when Allison was born. He would spend his days playing around, and even dipped into Allison's tuition fees. Despite failing to fulfill any fatherly duties, Steve thought only of his pleasure and started a new family. Did he ever consider how Allison and I felt? As various thoughts raced through my mind and left me speechless, Allison pointed at the TV that was still on and said, "Huh? Dad, aren't you watching TV?" At her words, Steve ended up shouting loudly, "My name is Jenny Ford. I'm a housewife in my 50s. I live with my husband, Steve, and our daughter, Allison. I met Steve at the company we both joined after graduating from college. Is there anything you don't understand? Feel free to ask." I was supposed to be trained by another, more experienced colleague. But seeing me nervous and unable to speak up without any work experience, it was Steve who approached me. Steve patiently explained the parts one was stuck on, and from that time on, I naturally started asking him various things. As we spent more time together, we quickly grew closer. Eventually, Steve confessed his feelings. "I fell in love with how dedicated you are to your work. Would you like to date me?" "I would love to." I had feelings for Steve as well, so we started dating, and things quickly led to marriage. A few years later, we were blessed with Allison. But that doesn't mean every day was joyful. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that those days were filled with pain. Mainly because of Steve's infidelity. This all started around the time I got pregnant with Allison. Steve had always treated me with great care, and when he found out I was pregnant, he even shed tears saying, "Thank you." My morning sickness was severe, and just the smell of food made me nauseous. After getting married, Steve strongly insisted, and I quit my job. At that time, Steve was up for a promotion, so I accepted his request. As a stay-at-home wife, I took on all the household chores. Being at home, I felt it was natural to handle the chores. But cooking while feeling sick was truly painful. "Hey, I'm sorry, but could we eat out for a while? Or could you bring home some prepared food?" I was reluctant to say it, as I was in charge of the household duties. But I gathered my courage and spoke to Steve, who was relaxing in the living room. Steve furrowed his brow for a moment and asked in a grave tone, "Why? You're a housewife, aren't you? If you don't do the household chores properly, it's a problem. Otherwise, you're just a freeloader." Indeed, what Steve said was not wrong. After all, I was living on Steve's money. Asking me to do the household chores in return was perfectly reasonable. But what can't be done, and I was definitely not being lazy. Desperately, I tried to convey my feelings to Steve. "I feel nauseous because of the morning sickness. Just smelling food makes me want to throw up. And it's hard to do any other chores with my heavy belly." "Shut up. That's just laziness. You're a housewife, so do your household duties properly. What will happen if I get sick because of your diet? It's your job to think about the nutrition and make a loving meal to welcome your husband." His harsh words made me dizzy on the spot. I didn't ask for help every day, but Steve would just relax in the living room on his days off. It would have been nice if he helped a little with the household chores. No matter how desperately I tried to express my feelings, Steve wouldn't listen at all. Thus, enduring the heavy belly and nausea, I somehow managed the household chores. It was a continuous hellish day, but when Allison was born, I felt that the painful days were over as I was moved by the sight of her crying in the delivery room. Steve said he was at work, didn't show up at the hospital, nor did he answer my calls. The nurse also seemed a bit uncomfortable looking at the situation. But while holding Allison, I could forget all the unpleasant things. I resolved from the bottom of my heart to protect this child for life. Whatever happens, I will make sure she can live without any hardships. True to form, Steve did not participate in child rearing at all. To ensure we had enough funds to raise Allison, I enrolled her in daycare and started working from home. Of course, I had discussed this with Steve. A housewife with no skills doing a job at home is almost like playing. It won't make much money, but do whatever you want. Without properly understanding the content of my work, Steve scoffed like that. Although I was honestly frustrated, I was now determined to work hard and use that feeling as motivation. Daddy, play with me. Steve usually relaxed in the living room even on weekends, and seeing him like that, Allison would sometimes call out to him. If it were me, I would immediately smile and want to engage with her. But Steve looked at Allison with displeasure and shooed her away. Daddy is busy. I don't have time to play with you. Go play with mommy. Saying that, he hurriedly got ready and left. I've noticed that Steve has been going out more lately. Not just on weekends, but he also seemed to return home later on weekdays. I checked the salary slips, but there was no sign of overtime. Having worked there myself, I knew the company did not impose excessive overtime. Could it be an affair? That thought crossed my mind, and I immediately hired a detective. It turned out he was indeed having an affair with another woman. Allison is here too. What are you thinking? This is unacceptable for a father. Let's get a divorce. I immediately thrust the divorce papers at him, furious. But Steve tried to appease me by saying, divorce, no. What about Allison? If she loses her father at such a young age, it could affect her personality. I had indeed worried about that. If we divorced now, Allison would grow up in a single-parent household. Even if it didn't affect her personality, she could be teased at school. However, that didn't calm my anger. It seemed likely that we would end up divorcing. But then, something made me reconsider divorcing. It was Allison's sleep talking. Daddy, let's play. As she breathed softly in her sleep, she murmured this in a tiny voice. Ever since Steve's affair came to light, there had been a tense atmosphere at home. Somehow, Allison must have sensed it. Still, she sought her father. The earnestness of it brought tears to my eyes. And I felt disgusted with myself for nearly taking her father away in anger. I decided that if a time came when Allison no longer needed a father, then I would consider divorce. I set the conditions for not divorcing, demanding a higher than usual amount of compensation from the affair partner and requiring Steve to spend time with Allison once a week. Eventually, it turned out that Steve covered the compensation that the affair partner should have paid, but I didn't care. As long as both were impacted, that was enough for me. Steve did keep his promise to play with Allison once a week. However, it didn't last long. I felt like complaining about the broken promise. But once our relationship had somewhat repaired and we no longer fought every day, I couldn't bring myself to bring up the past and potentially cause Allison pain again. Time passed, and we both entered our 50s. Allison, whom I had cherished so much, was now over 20 and had a job, able to live on her own. Steve had been on an overseas assignment alone for the past 3 years. So I was left to live alone at home. Worried about me, Allison had lived at home even after she started working. Since the assignment, Steve seldom showed his face at home. Gradually, Steve's presence faded from our lives. That day, Allison was also off work. And we were lazily watching TV and eating snacks when the doorbell rang. Yes? When I checked, there stood Steve and a blonde young woman holding a stroller. At a glance, she seemed about Allison's age. The babies in the stroller were sound asleep, not understanding what was happening just from the video. I hesitantly opened the front door to let them in. "Hello, ma'am. My name is Mandy Stone. I've been seeing Steve." Her words stunned me. Not only had this man betrayed his family once, but he had done it twice. And with someone so much younger than his daughter. The very idea that a man in his 50s could be so enraptured with such a young woman was nauseating. Seeing me speechless from shock, perhaps realizing the impact, Steve laughed shallowly and said, "I've got a new family, so we're getting a divorce. Take your daughter and leave. Oh, and I think you know, but don't expect a single penny for compensation." "Oh, Steve, you're terrible." Their gleaming eyes seemed to say, "Take that," as they both smirked at me, seemingly mocking my speechlessness. Only the sleeping babies in the stroller were oblivious, breathing quietly. This scene reminded me of Allison's sleep talking from that time. But Allison, who had been quietly watching us, suddenly pointed at the TV. "Huh? Dad, aren't you watching TV?" At her words, everyone's eyes turned to the TV. The screen flashed. Today's top female CEO. Rumored yearly revenue of $500 million. The camera switched to the interviewee, and Steve suddenly shouted, Why are you on the screen?" Yes, the female CEO being interviewed was me. After Allison went to daycare, I had started working from home. What began as minor work gradually became more significant. And I established a company to help people like me find good projects. Unexpectedly, there was a demand, and the business grew significantly. Registering as a publicly traded company 2 years ago. Now, it was considered a dream company for people doing similar work. With constant job applications and project requests. Explaining this, Steve's face turned pale. Mandy seemed flustered at first, but quickly tried to cover for him. "But, Steve, you're earning a lot too, right? Maybe not $500 million. But you said you're a director and up for promotion, right?" Hearing this, I accidentally let out an "what?" It seemed Steve had fabricated achievements to impress Mandy. "He's just a regular employee, though." "What?" Indeed, there was talk of Steve's promotion at the beginning of our marriage. But that was cancelled because he embezzled company funds. Even if it was a small amount, embezzlement is embezzlement. Crying about the terrible mistake he made, I felt pitiful for Steve and repeatedly begged the CEO. Paying back several times the embezzled amount with interest. Of course, that money came from my savings. I had a particular connection with the CEO. And he agreed to continue employing Steve under the condition that he would never be promoted. No matter what, as a concession for my desperate pleas. I am truly grateful to the CEO, but I also feel it was an unnecessary effort. As a result, Steve could never advance in his career, let alone become a director. Probably he lied to make himself appear better to Mandy. Exposed, Mandy's face turned pale with shock. "Why would you lie about that? You're not a manager? Just a regular employee. That's unbelievable. If I had known, I wouldn't have gotten involved." Mandy screamed in a fit of rage. Amid her outburst, Steve, with tears in his eyes, tried to justify himself. "I had no choice. I just wanted you to notice me. I really loved you, Mandy." The spectacle of two adults in such a mess was truly unsightly. Amid this chaotic scene, Allison came out from her room holding an envelope, spreading its contents across the table. Actually, I knew Dad was having an affair. Everyone, including me, was shocked by her revelation. She explained that it all started when one of her friends spotted Steve in the country, despite his supposed business trips abroad. After confirming that the photos indeed showed Steve, Allison immediately hired a detective and began an investigation. She financed this by explaining the situation to my parents, and decided to focus on the areas where Steve had been spotted. According to Allison, this turned up a wealth of evidence of the affair. However, she hadn't found the courage to report it to me, worried about how deeply it might shock me. After all, the other woman was nearly her age, and Allison felt that revealing the affair would deeply hurt me. She decided to wait and see for a while. During this pause, today's incident occurred. The table was now cluttered with documents and photos evidencing Steve and Mandy's affair. Ignoring their flushed faces, Allison continued. To be honest, Dad, what you're doing is the lowest of the low. Betraying Mom and secretly starting another family is absolutely unforgivable. I barely have any memories of you playing with me, but now, I've completely lost respect for you. Allison must be feeling an indescribable disgust. I, too, was overwhelmed by the wastefulness of spending any more time on these people. I wanted to wrap up this mess quickly. But first, they needed to face the consequences. Of course, I intend to demand compensation. And I will also inform the president of your company. At the mention of the president, Steve's face turned ashen. And for good reason. The president, of course, is the CEO of the company where Steve works. If this matter comes to light, given his prior misconduct, Steve will likely be fired this time. Wait, why can you contact the president directly? You're just a former regular employee. You shouldn't have that kind of authority. Well, about that. As Mandy pointed out, it wouldn't normally be possible for a mere former employee like me to contact the CEO directly. Why I could do that was due to my relationship with the CEO. My father and the CEO are childhood friends. Steve and Mandy simultaneously exclaimed, "What?" This was something I had never even told Steve. What do you mean? I didn't know about this. That's all there is to it. My father has a long-standing relationship with the CEO. Which is why I got a job at that company. Oh, don't get me wrong, it wasn't through connections. But it helped when Steve committed embezzlement, although, it was pointless in the end. I wonder what the CEO will think when he finds out how much his old friend's daughter has been hurt. As I said this with a hint of sarcasm, Steve's face went from pale to ghostly white. With just one word from me to the CEO, Steve might be fired instantly. Already guilty of embezzlement, if he were to lose his current job, he'd likely find it impossible to find another. If that happens, he would truly be left destitute. It's unlikely that Mandy alone could support the twins and cover all the family's expenses, leading to a collapse for the entire family. What do you mean? I thought marrying you as a director meant a secure future. I thought I could live comfortably. What are you going to do now? Realizing the reality, Mandy's face turned bright red as she grabbed Steve by the collar. It was understandable, as she thought she had hit the jackpot, only to find out she was with a mere blowhard. As Mandy shook him, Steve desperately tried to maintain a smile, though his face remained ashen. But think about it. If we have the power of love, can't we overcome this? We have a family. Let's pull together for the sake of our family. I believed we could do this together, Mandy. His persuasion was pathetically poor. But such sweet nothings wouldn't sway Mandy. She was likely only interested in the fortune she thought Steve possessed, not in Steve himself. Originally, the likelihood of a young woman like Mandy genuinely falling in love with a man in his 50s for pure reasons is extremely slim. If he were more mindful of his appearance, there might be a slight chance. But Steve is a typical middle-aged man with a protruding belly and a greasy look. Even if I were younger, I wouldn't want to date someone like him. I'll never forgive you. There's no marriage. And make sure you pay child support. These kids are yours, after all. What? Weren't you going to marry me? This isn't what we agreed on. As Steve pleaded tearfully, Allison intervened. But we don't even know if these kids are really dad's, do we? What do you mean? Confused, I tilted my head. Allison then pulled out another document from the envelope. It seems there was still some documentation that hadn't been shown yet.
Ah.
Stop it. The moment Allison revealed the document, Mandy screamed and lunged to cover it. But a photo fell onto the table. It showed Mandy walking through a hotel district with an unknown man. You had another man besides Steve. What the? When I spoke, Steve snatched the photo I had in my hand. Seeing it, his face turned bright red, and in his anger, he yelled at Mandy. What does this mean? You were betraying me too, weren't you? I really loved you, Mandy. Yet you go off with another man. It's not like that. It's not. Shut up. The kids probably aren't even mine. I won't recognize them as mine until we do a DNA test. Mandy broke down in tears at Steve's words. To think she cheated and even tried to trick him into raising another man's child. Despite being the same age as Allison, she seemed all too cunning. With evidence of the affair and grounds for compensation. It seemed unlikely that Steve and Mandy could repair their relationship. Just as I thought the matter was settled, Steve suddenly started to apologize. What are you thinking? As I asked this, Steve cried out desperately. I realized that you're the only one for me, Jenny. I love only you. I may not have been a good husband before, but I'll do better this time. Please, let's try again. I can't do this without you. What does he mean, he can't do this without me? If that were true, he wouldn't have gone after Mandy. His words now don't move me at all. I'm sorry, but I have no intention of retracting the divorce. Allison and I will leave this house. I'll send the divorce papers by mail, so please sign them and submit them to the office. Saying that, I returned to my room. Allison, sensing what needed to be done, also went back to her room. After some time preparing our things, Mandy and the baby had disappeared. But Steve was left crying alone in the living room. Please reconsider. Don't leave me alone. Despite his pleas, we ignored his presence completely. Allison and I then left the house together. We decided to stay in a hotel for the time being. Once we find a house, we plan to move immediately. The divorce papers have been sent, and I've already consulted with a lawyer. If there are any delays in the filing of the divorce papers, I can discuss that too. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Allison continues to go to work as usual. At first, we considered looking for separate homes. But it seems Allison thought I seemed very lonely and suggested, let's live together in the new house. I gratefully accepted her proposal, and together we searched for a new home. Worked, and sometimes went out to play. With Steve out of the way, Allison and I could enjoy our time together. For the first time since my marriage, I could genuinely enjoy various activities without any worries. However, this happy time wouldn't last forever. On a weekday, while I was at the office checking the day's schedule with my secretary, my phone began to ring incessantly. It was Steve. Of course, I couldn't answer it during work hours. I always make sure to keep work and private life separate. So, I ignored it, but it kept ringing off and on repeatedly. So annoying. Frustrated, I decided to answer the still ringing phone when I returned to the hotel. It seemed from the call history that he had been calling nonstop since the first time I noticed. Before I could even say hello, I heard Steve's voice, desperate and pained. "Help me. I'm about to lose the house." Hearing his words, I honestly just sighed. "Is that all? Of course you are. After all, that house isn't in your name." Yes, the family home we had been living in was registered in my name. Initially, the house was under both Steve's and my name. However, after Steve embezzled funds and no longer had prospects for promotion, it seemed unlikely we could keep up with the mortgage payments. So we transferred the deed to my name. In essence, I had been the one paying for the house's mortgage all along. Steve had contributed very little, so it was only natural to evict him if I decided to leave. It's astonishing that he couldn't even realize something so fundamentally obvious. It seemed I had been too lenient with Steve for too long. If I had been clearer about my intentions, perhaps the future would have been different. After hearing my words and perhaps recalling these events, Steve, in a pathetic state, desperately clung to any hope. "Please do something. The president said I'm fired. Without a job and now possibly a home. How am I supposed to live? That's not my problem. Sort it out yourself." This situation was entirely Steve's own doing. If he hadn't betrayed our family, even if our relationship wasn't the best, we might have managed to continue as a family. It was all Steve's fault that this was no longer possible. Yet, he refused to accept his own faults and clung disgracefully to any semblance of hope. How could he continue to expose such an appalling side of himself? Even if he showed such a state, I wouldn't sympathize. As far as I was concerned, my relationship with Steve was over. Honestly, it was tiresome even to deal with him, so I decided to end this once and for all. If you hesitate to submit the divorce papers, I'll take it to court. It will probably make it even harder for you to find a job, poor thing. And you still have to pay compensation. Are you sure you can manage?" Upon hearing my words, Steve gasped on the other end of the phone. I added, almost as if to seal his fate, "Oh, and about the president, he seemed angrier than I expected. It looks like he's spreading the word about you everywhere. How nice for you. You're quite the celebrity now." "What? Please do something. If this happens, I'm finished." Steve's voice was steeped in despair. It was almost too delightful, and I couldn't help but let out a smile. But all of this was Steve's fault, after all. For years, Steve betrayed both Allison and me. It was probably a mistake to have married him in the first place. Why did I ever marry such a person? I deeply regret being drawn to Steve in my younger days. I don't know what to tell you. It's all your own doing, isn't it? I'm going to hang up now. I'll send you the lawyer's contact information later, and you can deal with them from now on. Goodbye. Wait, Jenny. Don't abandon me." After Steve's last words, I hung up the phone. The ringtone sounded several more times after that. But I promptly put Steve's number on the block list and sent him only the lawyer's contact. Then blocked him. This ensured that Steve could no longer contact me. I decided to remind Allison to block his number as well. Feeling relieved that everything was finally settled. From what I heard through the lawyer, Steve initially hesitated to sign the divorce papers. But when faced with the possibility of a lawsuit, he submitted them quietly. However, that wasn't the end of it. To pay the compensation to me, Steve borrowed a large sum of money from dubious sources. One might wonder why he would turn to such sources. But after this incident, his own parents disowned him, having spread the word among his friends beforehand. Steve found himself without any support and was forced to resort to these desperate measures. Though he managed to pay the compensation, Steve could not repay his debts and ended up being taken away by shady individuals. I heard through the grapevine that he is now working on a tuna fishing boat. I also demanded compensation from Mandy, but all of it was covered by her parents. I thought maybe I hadn't impacted her significantly, but that turned out not to be the case. Enraged by the incident, Mandy's parents are now controlling all of her earnings. Despite her youth, she cannot freely use her own salary, and her beauty is reportedly fading. As for the twins, it turned out they were indeed not Steve's children. They are now being taken care of by Mandy's parents. When I met them once with a lawyer present, they seemed like decent people. So I'm confident the twins will grow up without issues. Quietly, I felt a sigh of relief. Now, I spend my days leisurely working. Interestingly, Allison also works as an office clerk in my company. Although she's my daughter, I don't favor her out of nepotism. But she is genuinely a skilled and well-liked employee in the office. One day, Allison said to me, "I have something to tell you." Worried it might be some scandal. My concerns eased when I saw the young man standing next to her. "I've decided to get married." Saying so, Allison blushed. As a parent, I have put her through many difficulties. Sometimes, I've made her experience harsh times. Yet, she grew up to be a fine person. And now she was sharing the happiest news in the world with me. Which brought tears to my eyes. "Mom, you're getting ahead of yourself. That's for the wedding day, right?" As Allison took out a handkerchief and wiped my tears, I couldn't help but cry a bit embarrassingly. The young man beside her smiled and said, "You have a wonderful mother." Despite all the painful times that made me want to run away, I was able to overcome them because Allison was there. Moving forward, I am determined to remain a person of whom she can be proud, as her mother.